What I'm hoping to do across the course of this morning/afternoon's talk is really three things. The first is just to share a deeply personal story, what took me from cradle to now standing in front of all of you here today. The second is to talk a little bit about organizational development, and so how we as individuals, as leaders within various companies and organizations, can take a certain approach to the way that we guide these organizations that you all are leaders within, and ultimately achieve outstanding results, oftentimes by taking non-traditional approaches to very traditional industries. And then the third thing is really the most important. When we think about the history of oration, why we come together in groups, why we gather at things like conferences, luncheons, even small group and community gatherings, there's two different historical purposes. The first is because a speaker has a message that they want to share and they ask others to come and participate. But the second I actually find is much more valuable, and it's actually the true origins of why we gather in groups, and it's to achieve some type of value exchange between one another. And so while I'll be speaking for a little bit to you all this afternoon throughout this lunch, my hope is that the ideas that I'm able to share with you actually change the conversations that you'll have across the rest of today, the weeks and months and even perhaps years ahead, not just with your colleagues that are here in the room, but perhaps with your colleagues that you work alongside, as well as ultimately your families as well. And so, that's really the third objective, is to share some of these lessons that I feel very fortunate to have been exposed to by first and foremost listening to great leaders over and over and over again, and then eventually documenting those observations, and then being a real steward of some of these lessons over the past several years. And so just so that I have a little bit of an understanding of who is in the room, how many of you here are married? Okay. How many are single? Okay, keep your hands up. Just look around a little bit. Okay. All right. I was a college basketball player. That's what we call an assist in the basketball world. So hopefully we can make some meaningful connections. How many of you have kids, just by a show of hands? Okay. Seems like the vast majority of the room. How about grandchildren? Okay. How many of you are the grandchild of someone else? Okay. All right. If anyone's hand is not up, I'm very skeptical of you, and you should maybe grab some coffee for the rest of the day ahead. But the reason that I asked that question is, in a lot of ways, I think every individual story really begins with the lineage from which we come from. Who is our family? Who are we the child of? Who are we the grandchild of? And so that's where I figured I would start with my story. And so this is a photo that I found in my grandmother's basement a couple years ago. So what you can see is my mother on the far left, my grandmother, my grandfather, my aunts, my uncles, etc. My grandma Dorothy lives in upstate New York in the Catskills. Has anyone spent any time in the Catskills by any chance? It's just an absolutely beautiful place. In particular, this time of year as we go into the autumn, it's kind of your picturesque, what you'd see on calendars of fall foliage. And so throughout my childhood, every month or two, growing up in the Northeast, we would go up to visit Grandma Dorothy and my grandfather Irving at their home in the Catskills. And when we'd visit, Grandma Dorothy would always say, go down into the basement and go hunting for treasures. And in their small home in the basement, there were literally rows and rows and rows of just stuff, things that for a child, was like a sense of wonder. As an adult, I've come to acknowledge that lightly, Grandma Dorothy is a hoarder. She's also an avid recycler, as she will tell you. She eventually wrote a book called Grandma Goes Green, which we have many copies of in our home. But it really was this sense of wonderment as a kid. As an adult, I started to think, are there things that I should actually be looking for in this basement? And fortunately, when I went back a couple years, I came across this photo, which is really a true treasure for me as now an adult in the world. And there's one real reason that I love this photo, that it is such an absolute treasure for me, and it's because how many of you are familiar with the character Borat? Have you heard of Borat? Okay. So Borat is heavily inspired by my father, as demonstrated by this photo, which he will deny to this day. But the resemblance is just uncanny. And so, while I knew my mother's side of the family story very well, I had an even more intimate experience with my father's side of the family. And so my father came to this country when he was 3 years old. He immigrated from Hungary, escaping over the border in the night, kind of one of those wild stories that you would almost read about in books or see in movies, onto a boat 14 days across the Atlantic to arrive essentially as a refugee in the Bronx, and then eventually grew up in Queens in New York. And what I knew so well about my dad's side of the family was the story of my grandparents. Again, that's why I asked about those of you being grandparents. So both of my dad's parents were Holocaust survivors. Both of them sent into concentration camps with family members, the vast majority of their family being sent to the concentration camps upon arrival, including parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins. And they miraculously survived. My grandmother through primarily Auschwitz, and then my grandfather through Dachau. And they met after the war. And so as you can imagine, when that experience occurs for any individual, and you are able to somehow miraculously survive, the number one thing in your life afterwards becomes your family, right? It's about how do you love those that you are closest to, build that bond. But at the same time, when I spoke to both of my father's parents, because they lived in the town next to us, so I got to see them really frequently, I asked, in particular, my grandmother, what was it that enabled you to survive when you're 14 as a young girl? You were working age, so everyone was spared. Your 12-year-old sister, your mother were all sent to the gas chambers the very first night. How did you survive? And what she came back and would explain to me was she believed that she was going to find her father after the war, because he had not been brought into Auschwitz with the rest of the family. And so while older people, stronger individuals physically, large men, you would witness perish in these camps, somehow this 14-year-old girl was surviving day after day for 14 months. And eventually, there's a book, it's probably the most influential book in my life, called Man's Search for Meaning. I see a few heads nodding. For those that aren't familiar with this book, I highly encourage you to pick it up. It's written by a gentleman named Viktor Frankl. But this book, Man's Search for Meaning, has been translated into dozens and dozens of languages, read millions of times. But what he really explores is that concept. He himself was taken to Auschwitz, but he was a social psychiatrist at the time, so he almost studied that human condition and asked that question of what is it that enables us to survive, to get through those moments of challenge. And what he came down to was this sense of purpose, of innate purpose, of this belief that you yourself have some reason for being, and that ultimately you are going to contribute to some broader whole. That there is something not today, but there's something in your future that you were almost meant to fulfill. There's another great book, The Alchemist, by Paulo Coelho, that I'm sure many of you have read as well, and it talks about this idea of a personal legend, right? That you're almost supposed to fulfill this moment in the future, and that you have to make decisions that are almost based on unreasonable acts of faith, that you believe you're going to achieve this thing in the future. And that was my grandmother's reason for survival, was she thought that she needed to be the lone survivor to be that rock for her father. And tragically, when she got out of the camp and eventually back to a train station in Budapest, she learned that her father had also perished at a separate concentration camp. And so, when she met my grandfather and developed this family after the war, beyond the bonds of family, the other thing they recognized was that even though you can take every single thing away from an individual, absolutely everything, that's what they experience, your worldly possessions, even your dignity. The one thing that you cannot take away from an individual is their ability to reason, their ability for intellectual exploration, for curiosity, for imagination. And where that most manifests is in the experience of education. And so that was the family that I came from. It was one where everything had been taken, and so the family was really the core. But at the same time, there was this relentless commitment to educational attainment, because that is what perpetuates the ascendance of opportunity from one generation to another. And so I remember growing up as a kid, and even though the work I do now is slightly different, the thing I was obsessed with as a child was actually the financial industry. So I know, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of investment represented in this room. Since I was a teenager, that's all I thought about. When I was 13, I opened up an E-Trade account. When I was 16, I did a summer at a hedge fund. When I was 19, I helped to launch a fund of funds. And that was the trajectory that I was incredibly excited about. But I came across this idea my junior year in college that is really the first kind of core lesson that I wanted to share this morning, because it's something that has stayed with me now for a pretty long time, and I think is important for all of us to occasionally be reminded of. And it's this concept that true self-discovery begins where your comfort zone ends. And for many of us, we meet new people. I'm sure many of you have met new people today. And later tonight, you might meet another individual at a dinner, or tomorrow at a park. And feel free to shout out, but when you meet somebody new, what's the first question that you ask, that person that they ask of you? What's the first common question that's asked? Feel free to shout out.
Where are you from? Name.
Where are you from? Name. Okay. Any subsequent question? You meet somebody at a cafe? What do you do? See a lot of people nodding heads. So I've asked that question in probably front of tens of thousands of people on multiple continents, and more than 90% of the time, that starting question across almost every single culture that I've been a part of is, what do you do? And I thought a lot about why is that? And there's certain reasons that you can give. It helps you understand how this person spends the majority of their time. It enables you to perhaps define some type of mutual shared relationship or connection or experience. You can kind of order them mentally, perhaps on a socioeconomic ladder or an experiential ladder, and see, okay, you almost determine value. Do I want to spend more time with this person, or is there an opportunity to build some type of exchange of value here? But my belief is the single most important reason that we ask somebody, what do you do, is because it helps us understand what they are. It puts a series of qualifiers around what they are. I'm a nurse. Okay, that's what that person is. And for many of us, I think our experience is one in which we actually make decisions around how we spend our time based on the perception of what we think we're supposed to do, based on these whats, these qualifiers. And the very first time that became present in my life was in college. Because, talk to any of your children, and they don't have a common answer to that question. The 12-year-old meets a 12-year-old at a park. It's like a crazy question, right? It's like, what team do you play on? Or like, what's your favorite color? Does your dad do ice skating? Because mine does. It's anything. But in college is the first time that you start these qualifiers, which is where do you go to school and what's your major? And I didn't know at that point in time, I knew what I wanted to be, but I didn't know who I was. And I think for many of us, we allow these qualifiers, these whats, to define the who that we're actually meant to be. And I think it's important for all of us to every so often acknowledge that this sense of true self-discovery actually begins where your comfort zone ends. And so my comfort zone ended really at the bounds of the experiences that I knew. I grew up in the Northeast. I went to college in the Northeast. Most of my friends either lived, because I played a lot of basketball, in call it suburbs. Some of them lived in the projects. I saw a pretty wide disparity of income and experience. My dad was this rough and tumble guy from Queens, so he just dropped my brother and I in the projects most days and was like, just go play ball, and left. And so we got a pretty wide exposure. But I had never been into other parts of the world where culture was radically different from my own. And so I really decided to adopt this idea. I learned about a program called Semester at Sea. Anybody here familiar with Semester at Sea? Okay, handful of hands. So Semester at Sea, who those aren't familiar with, is a study abroad program that actually occurs on a 1,000-person cruise ship. It's been going on for 50 years. And students go on this ship, and they have the opportunity to literally circumnavigate the globe in about 100 days. You usually get out in 10 different countries. You have 4 to 6 days to go out and explore this country completely unsupervised. You throw on a backpack and travel with a floating campus of professors. And it's a really extraordinary experience, and it opened my eyes up to all of these different cultures that I had never been to parts of myself that I didn't know were there, things that really made me come alive, because I was now beyond the bounds of what I was, but it was more about learning who I was. And so I came back a very different person. As you heard, I asked a boy on the streets of India what he wanted most in the world, and the street beggar said to me he wanted a pencil. And in the town where I grew up, people weren't asking for pencils. They wanted video games, or they wanted the latest technology, or they wanted to maybe try and own a sports team or something like that. And I started to ask more questions. I realized this boy had never been to school before for a day in his life. and that the average pencil holds 40,000 words. Every pencil, 40,000 words. And that, there is so much beauty and wisdom in this request. So, again, it seems like many of you have children, but my guess is, when you ask kids questions, you expect an answer that you want them to say. And how often do they actually say the thing that you're expecting them to say? It's not very often, right? And so what you find is there's this incredible wisdom and beauty to the responses that these children will give you. And that happened with me and this boy. And so I had a pencil, I gave it to him, he just lit up, he was so excited. All these other kids started gathering around, I had other pens and pencils, and I just became obsessed with travel. Through as many countries as I could go to, I'd start a small business, take that money, get a one-way ticket to a rural part of the developing world. It's just where I felt most alive. And these communities always took me in and just demonstrated incredible dignity and humility, but they didn't have access to education. The one thing that enabled my family to rise up from the concentration camps to getting access to a great education for myself and my siblings. And so I moved into New York afterwards, and I had 2 job offers, 2 kind of ones that I was excited about. One of them was at the #2 investment bank in the country in their leveraged finance group, which was going to be very well paid and very exciting. The other one was at Bain & Company in management consulting. This was 2007. And every person said, take the banking job. You're going to make more money. The difference is probably maybe $40,000. That's a huge amount of difference for someone who's just coming out of college. Take the banking job. You'll make more money. But I knew that one day I wanted to run and guide organizations that focused on education. And I had one mentor of mine say, no, Adam, focus on the job that's going to teach you the most for the person you want to one day be. Now is the time to take the risk. There'll be other moments in your life where you actually should choose the job that pays you more money, but do it when the delta's bigger, which is going to be later in your career. And also, do it when you don't have the opportunity to invest in your learnings in the way you can today. And so in 2007, I turned down this job at Lehman Brothers in their leveraged finance investment banking group. A lot of rooms don't really get that. I figured you guys would understand what that reference means. But I ended up working at Bain, and while I was at Bain, I had this incredible set of training and learning experiences. But I came back to this idea that true self-discovery begins where your comfort zone ends. And young 20-something in New York, you get pretty self-absorbed. Your whole life revolves around your work life and your social life, and nothing else. And I remember just thinking, it would be really, really powerful if I could just do something where I could find a way to bring in this third element, this sense of purpose that I had when I was traveling. And I think a lot of times it's difficult for us to take a leap of faith, to do something uncomfortable, when we have these kind of comfortable norms around us that enable us to be content. There's a big difference between meaning and happiness. A lot of people equate the two. Meaning usually means a lot of struggle. Happiness is very different. People that pursue happiness pursue something very different from meaning. And there's a lot of studies on this. But I recently found this video that I think really beautifully articulates how we take that leap of faith. When you get to the edge of that precipice and you want to go into the uncomfortable, the unknown, it's kind of difficult. And so I'll show you all this video that I think really beautifully illustrates how we do it. If we could turn up the volume. So I think it does a good job. I think it's actually really representative, right? I mean, we walk to the edge and you look down and it's kind of scary and you don't know how you're going to be able to do this thing. And then some external force comes into your life and pushes you from behind. And you usually don't see it coming. And a lot of times it's actually something or someone that's kind of close and familiar to you. But they give you that push. And then you fall in the water and you realize, I have the support system around me that I need. That little girl had floaties, and her mom comes over and goes to help her, and she's going to be okay. And so, in my life, I had that forcing function in that the economy just tanked in late 2008. All my friends were losing their jobs. Fortunately, myself and my colleagues at Bain didn't, but the world looked like a very different place. And right around then, my grandmother that I was telling you about was turning 80. And she lives in the mecca of Jewish grandmothers, which is Boca Raton, Florida. And some of you probably have clients and colleagues and friends that are there, maybe family. But in Boca, there's a real battle for pride over grandchildren around the pools of Boca Raton, Florida. And I was hearing a lot about this. And I thought, I can get her a set of golf clubs because she likes to golf. I can get her a gift certificate to a restaurant. But what would really be meaningful? What if I, instead of living in service of myself, which is primarily what I was doing at that point in my life, what if I just lived in service of Ma? If I just did everything I could to make her as happy as possible? And I came up with this idea that maybe I could find a way to build one school, because she was taken out of school. And both my grandfathers had passed away. Perhaps I could find a way to honor her in her lifetime so she would know that her legacy would carry forward for generations. And so I got this idea, I'm going to find a way to build one school and dedicate it to Ma, and surprise her for her 80th birthday with it. The problem was it was late 2008. I didn't have much money. My friends certainly didn't have much money. So I went to my local bank. I said, I want to open up a bank account. What does it take? And the woman said, well, you have to start with at least $25 to open up a bank account with us. Obviously, I didn't look like a particularly wealthy individual as a 24-year-old, so she said $25 is what you need at least to start. And so I said, great, that's a really great sign. I turned 25 this month. And so this was the founding deposit that created Pencils of Promise. As you can see, it's October 1st, 2008. Lehman Brothers had declared bankruptcy about 2.5 weeks earlier, and $25 went in. And every single person said to me, this is not going to be possible. It's really nice. It's pleasant as an idea that you honor your grandmother, you want to impact a community, but it's just not going to be possible because no one's really going to give right now. Your friends don't seem to have any money. You want to support children in parts of the rural developing world that don't look anything like the people that are here in New York where you're working. It's just not going to happen. This is where I want to share the second idea this morning, which is something that right around that time I think I discovered and has really kind of powered a lot of my thinking ever since. And so it's this simple concept that all of our greatest limitation is the fear of this concept of what if. Because throughout every one of our days, we make probably 10 to 100 conscious decisions that depend on our willingness to embrace the what if, right? My guess is every single one of us, I certainly know it's true in my professional career. At the start of my day, I know the 2 or 3 things that will move the needle most, right? Those 2 or 3 big relationships that I need to convert, or those opportunities for a contribution or an investment or a relationship or a partnership. And what do? We ignore those things, right? We do a lot of easy stuff throughout the day. We clear our inbox. We get small wins because we oftentimes are kind of paralyzed by this notion of what if I do send that email? What's going to happen? And what I've come to see is there's 2 different types of people, really professionally, from my experience, that can be kind of bucketed between those 2 different approaches. There are some that look at the what if and they say, something, if I send that email to that person and they reject me or they don't want to move forward, I'm going to feel miserable. And I don't want that feeling, so I'm just going to ignore it. And if I send that, pick up the phone and call that person, I invite them to lunch, and I make the ask that I've been holding off on, I've been developing this relationship, and they don't convert, I'm going to feel like crap. And I just don't want that in my life. And so most people, I think, are paralyzed by this limitation of what if. Right? What if I put the money in the bank account and try and build a school and it doesn't work out? And everyone sees publicly that I failed at this big attempt. My reputation's going to be hurt. I'm going to look like an idiot. What if that happens? I'm not willing to move forward. But there's another subset of individuals that look at the what if and fall in love. They fall in love with the possibility of what can be unearthed if we pursue the what if in ways that others won't. What if I send that email and the person actually says yes and doubles their gift, or doubles their commitment, or doubles their investment, or introduces me to a relationship that I didn't even know could be the thing that unlocks that space that I need to get into next. And so I said, what if? What if I, rather than asking for birthday gifts, how many people here have a birthday in the next 365 days? Okay. Again, anyone's hand that didn't go up, question that person. But my birthday was Halloween. And so I thought, this is great. She asked for $25. It's my 25th birthday coming up later this month. I'm going to ask friends to come to a Halloween party and just give $20 at the door. And it was New York. And so we found a way to get a lot of people to come out. 400 people came. We had $8,000. My friends and I said, well, there's a real opportunity here to kind of reframe the way that people are thinking about this current period in our society. Because there's a lot of darkness, especially in New York, 2008. And one of the things that I would share with you all is just an important statistic to be aware of, which is that 84% of all individuals will switch from a product, good, or service if all things are equal and one of those products or services has a positive social impact on our society. When you look at the behavior of millennials, it's 91%. And so if you have the same experience, but you can tie it to something that has a unique positive benefit to the well-being of others, people will go towards that thing. Brand loyalty is not as powerful as we think it is. And so I knew there's a lot of events going on in New York, and 20-somethings weren't going to stop spending $20, $30, or $40 on a Friday or Saturday night. And so my friends and I started organizing more and more events, low dollars, but every dollar would go towards building a school. And pretty quickly, through these small events in late 2008, we raised $35,000 to build our first school. I went out to rural Laos. I took a break from Bain through their externship program. And I found myself in this rural community in the backwaters of Laos as our first school was underway. And I turned around one day, it's a very kind of first month of construction, and these three beautiful little girls are peering over my shoulder. So I'll show you this video now that I shot back then in early 2009. You'll hear me say Jia Sun Yang, which means what's your name, and then Nin Day, which means smile. So you'll see there's a primary school, and then you'll see bricks, which were a preschool, our very first school.
And you're going to be our first preschool students. Sounds good. I think you guys like it.
So at this point, everything changed, because now it actually wasn't about honoring my grandmother alone. It was actually about the commitment I had made, this promise to these three young girls. They were going to be our first students. And so as a millennial, I'm at the top end of the millennial band. We were like the first to be called millennials. I did what any of my friends would do. I went online, I posted on Facebook, and I tagged all the people that contributed, and I said, you deserve to know where your money's going. This is who you're impacting. And this video went viral. All these people started sharing it. I started to get all these inbound messages saying, I want to be a part of this. I'm usually not told where my money goes. For example, just by a show of hands, if any of you were to put your capital into an investment management fund, and at the end of that year, that fund was to send you smiling photos of their fund managers as a representation of the success, how would you feel about that? But yet, that's what happens in the not-for-profit space, right? There isn't the same level of accountability. It's not driven by ROI. It's driven by sometimes just wanting to feel good, and that's what organizations might play up. But there wasn't a commitment to having the DNA of a great business, which is what I'd always been trained on. And so at Pencils of Promise, that's what we built in. We had radical transparency. We produced these really, really robust quarterly data and impact reports with just an insane amount of data to them. And things started to grow, but we also believed in making sure that people understood where this story went. And so 4 months later, all these people that had said, I want to hear what happens with these girls, I sent this photo, which is now actually in their first classroom. And so the school was coming to life, right? And people said, I want to get more involved. I want to get more involved. And so that's where the third idea really takes shape that I want to share this morning, which is that you become your expectations. And having worked in education now for more than a decade, this is something that is proven in the classroom. And it also manifests into how we operate in business and certainly how we operate in our homes with our children. You become your expectations. If you want to convert a D student into an A student, the fastest way to do it is not necessarily just having them sit in classroom, for a longer period of time. The fastest way to do it is convince them that they are an A student. And then they will hold themselves accountable to that standard and actually achieve it. There's a lot of studies that have demonstrated this at the higher education level on down. And so, the same thing applies to our expectations with our organizations and our companies. And so how many are familiar with the concept of a BHAG? Okay, just a few. So BHAG is a concept, I believe the originator of it was Jim Collins, who wrote the book Good to Great and Built to Last. But it stands for Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal. And what it means is that there are moments in your organization, your company, your fund, et cetera's life, where it's actually incredibly helpful to set a moonshot out there, this huge, audacious goal that forces your thinking to change pretty drastically because it holds you accountable to the what if. What if we did this? What if we did that? And maybe it's not attainable, but if you aim for the sun, you end up at the moon. That's actually a pretty good thing. And so we had not done that yet. And so I remember 2011, I'd left Bain to work on this full time. We had maybe 15, 30, 20 schools, something like that. And I sat down with my COO at lunch, and I said, we need to establish a BHAG. We're going to build 100 schools by the end of next year. And he was like, that's kind of crazy. I think the team's going to be concerned. If that's a goal, it's just not realistic. And I said, what's the worst that's going to happen? Let's establish a BHAG. We're going to break ground on our 100 school. Let's start saying it publicly. And if we start telling every person, and that becomes the drumbeat, that becomes the ethos of what we're creating, I think we'll rise to the occasion, or we'll certainly get a lot further than we would have if we hadn't. And so we set this goal out there. And we started explaining the story of what we were doing. We started in Laos, we grew to Nicaragua and Guatemala, eventually in Ghana. And this is what a school looks like in many communities. This is one in particular where we've worked in rural Ghana. And this is considered a school for a village of 800 people. So for those of you that have children of both genders, what often happens is when this is considered your school is a parent has to choose, do I send my son or my daughter? And so oftentimes they will send their son, and so girls will fall behind. There's also not latrines here. And so in particular for young girls that at a certain time of the month need a private space, they won't even choose to go to school. They'll say, send my brother instead, and that was just unacceptable to us. And so we were able to convert this community school from that into this, which is what a full Pencils of Promise school actually looks like today. And pretty quickly, we started to build this tremendous amount of momentum. And eventually, by early 2014, I wrote this book that you heard referenced called The Promise of a Pencil. The important part was the subtitle, how an ordinary person can create extraordinary change. Because that's my core belief, I don't think I'm special in any way. I think I'm very unreasonable in my belief systems. And I think that I'm willing to say things that if others believe in, we can collectively go and achieve. And so the book was framed around 30 short chapters. And every chapter is titled with a mantra, and those mantras were the lessons learned along the way from great leaders that I had learned, and kind of sat at the foot at. And fortunately, the book blew up, and it was used by companies, it's used by a ton of colleges as the common read, and it not only allowed us to build those 100 schools by 2011, but now, about 8 years in, as of today, we've broken ground on just about 420 schools around the world. We have about 70,000 students in our programs every single day, and it's reached true scale. So I've been describing it for a little bit. Would it be helpful, do you guys want to just see a 2-minute video of what it actually looks like in the field? Okay. So this is a 2-minute video. We'll bring it to life a little bit, primarily shot in Ghana.
Pencils of Promise began in hopes of building one school. We believe that where you start in life shouldn't dictate where you finish. And that every child deserves access to a quality education. That belief took us around the world, building schools in Asia, Latin America, and now Africa. Today, there are more than 400 Pencils of Promise schools. Every single one of those means so much to a child, a family, and a community. But it's also changed the life of someone who, just like you, learned about us and decided to make these kids a part of their story too. While I built the first school to honor my 80-year-old grandma, a college DJ sold albums to build our 30th. Joel ran a marathon to build our 50th. Kennedy biked across the entire country to build our 70th. Sophia asked for donations instead of birthday presents to build our 90th. And George, a university student from Ghana's passion, put us over the 100 school mark. These are the stories of people just like you. Every single one of us has the ability to change a life. You just have to believe in it. You just have to become dedicated to it. How will you build the next Pencil of Promise school? Go to pencilsofpromise.org to learn more.
So hopefully that brings it to life, what it actually looks like, feels like in the communities that we ultimately serve. But a very interesting thing happened about 2 years ago, which was, as I mentioned, this book is used on a lot of college campuses. And so I was getting asked by a lot of colleges to come and speak and address the students, which is something that I absolutely love doing. And so I've gone to almost every single type of college that you can imagine in the last several years. Elite private schools, large state schools, community colleges in Tennessee and Arizona, places in between. And I would go to these campuses and I'd say, you should get involved in Pencils of Promise to these young, excited, passionate individuals. And on every single campus, regardless of the geography, regardless of the type of college, there was one refrain that I heard consistently. It wasn't from all students, but it was from a meaningful subset of the students. And they would say, Adam, it's really nice what you're describing. I'd love to be able to go do that, but I'm crushed with student debt, and I can't even consider this. And I kept on hearing it over and over and over again. And they're also saying, I don't even really have the skills necessary through my higher education to actually be able to enter the workforce and get a job to pay back my debt. And again, over and over, I was hearing this. And then I met my wife. And my wife was one of those people. Grew up in a very loving family, but without a lot of financial means. Went to college under the belief that college was going to be the springboard to greater success. Had to leave early, 3 years in, because the debt was so large and she needed to start working and supporting herself and her family. And by the time that I met my wife, the debt was the biggest burden by far on every decision that she made. And what I learned was she had $110,000 of debt without a bachelor's degree. And when you see the toll that takes on somebody's life, it's pretty motivating. And the more that I did the research, the more that I looked at the state of our education system, I don't know how many of you share this belief, but it is fundamentally broken for millions and millions of young Americans. Some institutions do a great job, but many unfortunately do not. And it felt like we needed new alternatives. And so I moved out to the Bay Area about 1.5 years ago to design and launch a new venture. Still supportive, incredibly, and very involved in Pencils of Promise, but I wanted to focus on something new. And our second month in the Bay Area, I got some news from my wife that completely changed the trajectory of our lives, which was that we were having twins. And I remember at the first ultrasound being told, you're expecting to see like your baby and the heartbeat, and then the doctor goes, oh, no wonder you're so sick, you have twins. And I made a facial expression, apparently, that I've never seen, but my wife recently sent me a photo and was like, that's the face. And it was this one that my son apparently can now represent, my son Dylan. And so, it really started to get me thinking about that question that I started the talk with, right, which is purpose. What is the role that each of us has to play in this unique journey that we're all on? And how are we uniquely positioned to make the largest impact that we can? And so it furthered this ambition to create what we launched publicly back in March, which is a new institution called MissionU. So MissionU, first of all, is a one-year college alternative for the 21st century. It's a radical reinvention of higher education in that when you get into MissionU, there's $0 in upfront tuition. We entirely invest in you for a full year. You don't pay us $1 throughout that year. And instead of any form of upfront tuition or debt, you commit to 15% of your income back to us for 3 years, 36 months, only when you're making $50,000 or more. And if you don't hit that within a certain threshold of time, you're absolved of any commitment going forward. And so we launched it in March. We had 25 spots in our first cohort. We had almost 5,000 applicants for those first 25 spots. And we now are looking at some very, very serious growth and additional cities. And so that was one thing that we were talking about beforehand is I think it's very likely that we'd like to come to Chicago at some point, 2018 or 2019. But I'd really encourage all of you to think about as you talk to your children about the next steps in their life and in their career, being savvy consumers of every single part of their journey, including their higher education, right? And kind of challenging that baseline of assumption about where the world is today versus where we all want it to be going forward. And a large motivation for me, and I hope for many of you, is something that was created by a gentleman named James Truslow Adams. Does anyone know who James Truslow Adams is? So I didn't know who he was at all until about 2 years ago when I started researching a very specific topic. And this is where I think we all in this room, I would imagine, are heavily aligned. So James Truesdell Adams is relevant to everybody here because in 1913 he wrote a book. I happen to have 2 copies in hardback of this book. They're very hard to find, but just in case I ever lost one, I have one like tucked away. And the book that he wrote is called The Epic of America. And the reason that it's relevant to all of us is the first articulation of something that we all now know as the American dream. The concept of the American dream was first established in this book by James Truesdell Adams in 1913, written in The Epic of America. And I just wanted to read a passage to all of you from this book, right, which is, the American dream is that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. It is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. That is the foundation, written over 100 years ago, of what we still all commit to every single day as citizens. And when I think about what most enables that, it was an honor for me to come here today because the work that every one of you are doing in this room enables that. Because if you think about it, what is the bedrock of community? What is the bedrock of the experience that so many of us have the luxury of experiencing? It's the flow of investment. It's the decision of how are we allocating these enormous pools of capital that ultimately allow the simple decisions, the simple pleasures of family, of community, of interpersonal dynamics of our workforce to exist. And so where I wanted to kind of close this morning's speech is just on a few kind of core lessons that I'd hopefully like to leave you all with, because the service that you are bringing through the work that you're undertaking goes so far beyond even the reach of, I think, what many of you probably are grasping on a day-to-day basis. It is so critical. And again, it's an honor for me to even be able to share some of these things. But the first idea is just that there's 3 forms of currency in our human experience. Many of us just think about money, in that we need money to be able to support our family, our loved ones, the things that we want in our life. And it's absolutely critical. But I'd encourage you to think about the second form of currency that we exchange with one another, which is mastery. The acquisition of new knowledge, sharing of new ideas, keeping learning curves steep. And that's actually what motivates our workforces. So my guess is many of you manage or work alongside millennials. This is really important to millennials. Do they have the ability to learn new things by virtue of participation in their job? It's a great TED Talk by a guy named Dan Pink that talks about motivation in our workforce. And he says there's 3 things. There's mastery, there's autonomy, and there's purpose. But that mastery piece is absolutely critical. And then the third one is meaning, our connection to our broader whole. And what I've found over the years is, in the first decade of anyone's career, I think they should exclusively optimize for mastery. The next piece of their life, money is probably very important for them to be able to build the family experience that they want. But I've met so many people later in their career that say, you know something, meaning is what matters most to me. I've learned as much as I really want to learn. I'm in a financial position where I'm okay, the incremental income isn't going to change my life that much. Where I really want to focus is in being of service to the broader whole. Extending that legacy for my children, for my grandchildren, et cetera. And I would just encourage you to think about that in the day-to-day decisions that you are making with the tremendous responsibility that each of you carry every single day in the roles that you have professionally. The next idea is this concept of passion versus purpose. Millennials, I think, like the curse of the generation is that we were told, follow your passion. That's terrible advice. I think it's really awful advice. It's like saying, be on a diet forever. Right? I mean, that's what passion is. It's like a diet, right? Or a workout craze. It's like you pursue it because you're excited about it. But what I am a huge believer in, and what I try and encourage anyone, especially younger folks that I spend time with, is to pursue your purpose, to do the deep, hard work of asking, what am I uniquely positioned to do? What are my accumulated experiences, relationships, kind of trajectory give me the opportunity to do that nobody else but me can accomplish? And that doesn't mean being an entrepreneur at all. It might mean contributing to a great company, launching a new idea, participating in an initiative within your community that could further the experience of other community members. But I'd really encourage you all to, when you speak to younger people, not tell them to pursue their passion, but ask them to evaluate what is their purpose and then pursue that. For me in those early days, it was about trying to honor my grandmother, and then it was about trying to get these 2-3 young girls, Nit and Tamund, access to an education. You saw what happened to them 4 months later. What I wanted to share with you all is what happens with them 8 years later. This is now Nit and Tamund today, now 6th graders. thinking about the next step in their life, wanting to be nurses rather than seamstresses or farmers, which, with an education you can think much bigger. And so the last idea is probably my favorite. It's this concept of becoming a 1 millimeter domino. And the best way for me to really explain it is to first show you my favorite video on the internet. It's about 60 seconds long, but I think it beautifully illustrates that.
And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick. And I'll carefully place it. And there are 13 dominoes. The largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds, and it's more than a meter tall. Ready? That was 13 dominoes. If I had 29 dominoes, the last domino would be as tall as the Empire State Building.
So it's just an incredible concept, really simply demonstrated. I mean, think of how small 1 millimeter. We're not talking a centimeter, we're talking a millimeter. And within 29 sequential steps, could be as tall as the Empire State Building. And what I find is that a lot of people, we have these ideas, we have these aspirations, and we're paralyzed by the notion that you don't have the Empire State Building built from day one. And what I encourage you to do is think of yourself as the 1 millimeter domino. And with Penciler Promise, it was $25 in a bank account. With MissionU, it was one college campus in particular, and making a commitment to a young person that I was going to try and help them find a better path. I think every single one of you within your families, within your roles professionally, within your work as trustees and stewards of incredible capital, think of yourself as that 1 millimeter domino. And I'm sure you'll face many difficult decisions along your way. But the best advice I ever received, which I'd share with you now, is to make the little decisions with your head, the big ones with your heart, and you'll be just fine. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So I think we have 10 minutes or so for a few questions. And one other thing is, since I'm going to have to go to the airport after this, I just wanted to share my email. If anybody has any questions, whether you want to talk to me about building a school with Penciler Promise, anything we're doing with MissionU, or just in any way that I can be supportive to you, your family, your work, this is the best way to reach me, and so you can just shoot me a note anytime. But happy to answer any questions. So the question was, what advice would I give to young people who would want to pursue something similar to what I've done? I'd have a couple things. The first would be to seek out really great mentorship. And I find that a lot of people think that they have to choose a mentor. And from my experience, a mentor chooses you. There's an experience within mentorship where you see a version of yourself that is several steps behind and younger, and it's almost like this avatar. And there's similarities, and you feel like, oh gosh, if I can just give them some of the stuff that I know and the relationships I have, and some of like the magic I possess, they can go and do things perhaps even bigger than I could have. But I also find that in a mentorship relationship, it's a two-way value exchange. Because mentors, I find, actually really want to learn from their mentees. Like they possess something that I don't know, and I can draw from them to make myself better at some pursuit. And so I think those relationships come through just deep listening and humility, getting in front of as many great people as you can and asking thoughtful questions. And then those mentors were incredibly instrumental, still are for me. And then I think the other thing is, try and get a job where you learn absolutely as much as you can from people that you respect and admire. And so for me, that was my experience at Bain. I mean, I'd been starting little businesses since I was 14. I think that entrepreneurial DNA, some people just it never goes away and it's always there. But my time at Bain taught me so much about how to build infrastructure, how to create incredible culture for companies and organizations that people really grow and learn within. And so I would say for a young person, try and find an opportunity and commit to it. The baby boomers on average work 10 to 12 years at a company. Gen X was 5 years. Millennials are closer to 18 months. And there's only so much you're going to draw from a relationship in 18 months. And so, when yesterday I was interviewing somebody for MissionU, And my last question to them was, look, I think you're outstanding. I think there could be a real opportunity to work together, but I need to know exactly how long you're willing to commit to work at this company. Do you want to be here for 12 months and then go on to your next thing? How long do you want to be here? And if I hear a response that's less than I'm looking for, I'll be upfront and I'll tell them it's just not going to work. And so I usually say I need at least 3 years. And what I also need is a commitment that you won't even consider interviewing elsewhere in that 3-year span without coming to me first to explain why you need to do that. And once you have that exchange of, I think, both loyalty and commitment to further each other's well-being, then you can establish a really powerful relationship. So the question was, can I speak more about the 1-year curriculum at MissionU and enhancement or replacement of traditional university? So the 1-year program is broken out into 3 trimesters. The first trimester we refer to as foundation. It's 8 core hard skills, which is what I was trained on at Bain, that make you valuable in almost any business context. So these are things like project management, giving and receiving critical feedback, business writing, public speaking, Excel modeling, basic tech foundation of HTML and CSS. And then separate from that in your first trimester, you do the hard introspective work to create really deep bonds with the other cohort members and soft skill acquisition. So we have 2 former lecturers from Stanford on staff that taught the 2 most popular courses at Stanford that were all about soft skills, and our students go through that. The second trimester is a deep dive into your major. Right now we have 1 major. It's data analytics and business intelligence. So rapidly growing field, incredibly well paying in the Bay Area where we are. Average starting salaries are between $80,000 and $90,000. And it's a field in which the competency matters much more than the credential. Where you went to college doesn't matter as much. Can you do the certain skill that is needed to perform that function is actually what matters, and there's technical tests for it. And then the third part is actually what most employers and students would say is most valuable in onboarding towards a great job, which is having real-world work experience. And so it's an internship or a scoped-out project with a real company. And so we went around and asked millennials, what are your dream companies? We established partnerships with those companies, so they advise on curriculum, we do on-sites and case studies and guest speakers, and then they get access to this diverse pipeline of talent. And our partners are companies like Spotify and Uber and Lyft and Warby Parker and all these great brands. And then to answer your second question, we also do something called Career Launch, which is we give them interview preparation all the way through to salary negotiation, which most people never get, but you can imagine as a 23-year-old how valuable that would be. And then, our perception is that for some students, it's going to be a full stack replacement, a traditional 4 to 6 year journey. For other ones, it's going to be a supplement. And, it's really about the place that they're at in their life and their psychographic profile rather than their demographic. So we don't say, we're looking for 22-year-olds. We're looking for people that are incredibly ambitious, want to go out and do something really special with their life and career, and feel like the current system, from a cost as well as from a learning perspective, just isn't going to serve them well. So the vast majority of our students have some type of college credit. They've gone to 2-year or 4-year school. Some of these are super elite, like GW. Others are local community colleges. And most of them have some type of credit and experience, but they're just looking out on the 4 to 6 year horizon to get a bachelor's degree. And they're saying, I just don't see how this is justifiable given the cost and the fact that this piece of paper isn't going to really change that much for me in the workforce, and I still won't have the skills I need. So we're seeing students kind of think of it as a true alternative, and for some, it's almost like the supplement that they weren't necessarily getting from the traditional system.
We do a lot of benchmarking to determine the level of success as investors. How do you measure your success?
Personally, or you're saying as that's the hardest thing in my life right now. It's interesting. I just wrote a blog piece about this, which is most of my life, I measured it on one thing, which was how much positive impact can I make on as many lives as possible in a deep and meaningful way. That was the main thing that drove me. And that was why Pencil of Promise exists. All these things was how can I use my one life from these survivors of this horrific atrocity? Like I shouldn't be here. So how do I honor that? And that means positively impacting as many people as possible. And now I have a 10-month-old boy and girl at home, and I really just want to be with them all the time. And so that counterbalance is a struggle. I don't think I've solved it or come close. But I still keep that first frame as an evaluation of how I define if I'm being successful or not. And then the second one is, am I being the best possible man, husband, father, sibling, etc., for my family? and that one is something that I'm definitely learning. But if I can honor those that came before me, both in my professional context, and then carry the legacy forward of what my grandparents did for me and what my parents did, then I'm starting to feel like I'm on the path to success.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.